All right, diving right in today, we're taking a deep dive into the Waqf Amendment Bill 2025.
Yeah, fresh off the press, right? Just passed the Lok Sabha, what, April 3rd?
After a 12-hour debate, no less.
Wow. Okay, clearly a lot to unpack here.
Definitely. We've got a pretty good spread of sources to work with, I think.
Yeah, looks like we've got the bar and bench report on how it went down in the Lok Sabha.
Uh-huh. And a release from the Ministry of Minority Affairs, the PIB, that sort of lays out the whole history of Waqf in India.
Oh, nice. Good context there.
Yep, and they give their take on what this new bill's all about, too.
Right, right. And looks like we've also got that Indian Express piece.
Yeah, that one's got a bit more of the political side of things, I think, the controversies and all that.
Yeah, always good to see those different perspectives.
And of course, we've got the actual text of the bill itself as it was introduced back in 24.
Perfect, so we can really get into the nitty-gritty.
Exactly. So where do we even start with something like this? What's the mission?
Well, I think our main goal here is to break down what Waqf properties actually are. I mean, how are they managed? How have they been managed historically in India? And what are the big changes that this 2025 amendment is trying to make?
Yeah, okay, good roadmap. And maybe just for anyone who's, not totally up on this, we should probably start with just defining what a WAF actually is.
Right, totally. So basically, the Ministry of Minority Affairs defines WAF as a permanent dedication of property. And that property can be, movable or immovable. So that's land, buildings, money even.
Okay, so like setting something aside for good.
Exactly. And it's dedicated by an individual for purposes recognized under Muslim law as, pious, religious, or charitable.
All right, so like a donation, but more, I guess, spiritual, maybe.
Yeah, very much tied to religious and charitable purposes.
Okay, so that's the basic idea. But then this 2025 bill comes along, and it seems to tweak this definition a bit, right?
Yeah, there are a couple of interesting changes there. So now the bill specifically says this dedication has to be made by someone who's been practicing Islam for at least 5 years.
5 years. Okay, so not just anyone can do this.
Right. And the other key thing is they have to actually own the property they're dedicating.
Makes sense, I guess. You can't really give away what isn't yours.
Exactly. And this seems to be directly related to this idea of waqf by user, which has been a thing historically.
Waqf by user, what's that all about?
So in the past, there were cases where if a property had been used for waqf purposes for a long time, it could be considered a waqf even if there wasn't like a formal deed saying it was dedicated.
Oh, interesting. So just based on how it was used.
Yeah, basically. But this amendment seems to be saying, nope, we need a formal dedication by a recognized owner who's been practicing Islam for a certain amount of time.
I see. So tightening up the definition a bit.
Exactly. And that could definitely have implications for properties that have been viewed as waqf just because of, long-standing community use.
Yeah, I can see how that could be controversial. So to really understand why this new bill is happening, we need to back up a bit. Look at how waqf has been regulated in India historically.
Totally. It's not like this is coming out of nowhere.
Right.
And luckily, we've got that timeline from the Ministry of Minority Affairs.
Yep.
It goes all the way back to the early 1900s.
Wow. Okay.
So one of the early laws was the Mussalman Wakf Validating Act of 1913. What this did was it basically made it legal to create waqfs that mostly benefited the founder's family. The idea was that eventually these would lead to broader charitable benefits.
Sort of like a family endowment, but with a charitable element down the line.
Exactly. Then in 1923, we had the Mussalman Wakf Act. This one started putting some basic rules in place for how waqf properties should be managed, like, keeping track of the money and being transparent.
Accountability, yeah.
Right. And then a few years later, the Mussalman Wakf Validating Act of 1930 came along. That one really solidified this concept of family waqfs.
So these early laws were really laying the groundwork for how waqf would work in India.
Yeah, establishing the basic legal framework.
So what happened after independence? Did things change much?
Big time. In 1954, we had the Waqf Act. This was huge because it was the first time that state Waqf boards were created.
State Waqf boards, what do those do?
So these boards are basically responsible for overseeing and managing Waqf properties at the state level.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And this act also led to the creation of the Central Waqf Council in 1964.
So a national level body.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The CWC was meant to kind of supervise all the state Waqf boards and try to create a more centralized system.
A more unified approach.
Right. And over the next few decades, there were several amendments to this 1954 Act, just trying to refine things and make the administration of Waqf properties better.
Okay, so lots of tweaking going on. And then in 1995, we get a brand new Waqf Act.
Right, a complete overhaul.
Yeah.
This one repealed the 1954 law and all its amendments.
A fresh start.
Yeah, basically. And one of the big things it did was establish Waqf tribunals.
Wax tribunals, what are those?
They're basically special courts that deal specifically with Waqf-related disputes.
Okay, specialized legal bodies.
Right. And their decisions were supposed to be final, not subject to challenge in regular courts in a lot of cases.
Interesting. So they had quite a bit of power.
Yeah. But even that wasn't the end of the story. In 2013, we had another set of amendments.
Right, the 2013 amendment. So what did that change?
Well, one of the key things was that it restructured those Waqf tribunals. They were now 3-member bodies, and one of those members had to be an expert in Muslim law.
So bringing in more specialized knowledge.
Exactly. The amendment also said that every state Waqf board had to have at least 2 women members.
More gender representation.
Yeah. And it also prohibited the sale or gifting of Waqf properties, really emphasizing that they're supposed to be permanent.
To prevent them from being, sold off or anything?
Yeah. Right. And they also increased the maximum lease period for Waqf properties from 3 years to 30 years.
Wow, big jump. Why was that?
The idea was to allow for better utilization of these properties and to generate more revenue from them.
Makes sense, I guess. Long-term leases could be more attractive to, potential renters or businesses.
Right.
All right, so that brings us pretty much up to date. Now we've got this 2025 amendment bill. So according to the government, why is this new legislation needed? What's the rationale behind it?
Well, the government says they want to modernize the whole system of how Waqf properties are administered.
Modernization, that's a pretty broad goal.
Yeah, and they also talk about reducing legal disputes surrounding Waqf properties and just making the whole process more efficient.
Streamlining things.
Right, and they say they want to fix what they see as problems left over from the 1995 Act and the 2013 Amendment.
Okay, so addressing some leftover issues. Anything else?
Yeah, they also want to increase transparency in how Waqf properties are managed, strengthen the governing structures, protect Waqf assets better, and even align India's practices with global best practices.
Wow. Okay, so a lot of goals there. Ambitious.
Definitely.
All right, so let's dive into the specifics of the bill itself. What are some of the key changes it's proposing?
One of the first things is that it actually wants to rename the whole act.
Oh, interesting. A new title.
Yeah, instead of the Waqf Act, 1995, it would be the Unified Waqf Management Empowerment, Efficiency, and Development Act, 1995.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
I know, right?
But it does make a statement, doesn't it?
Yeah, you can really tell what they're trying to emphasize with that new title.
Okay, so new name, check. What else?
Another big one is how they deal with waqf al-alad, those waqfs that are set up for the benefit of the founder's family.
Right, we talked about those.
So the bill specifically says that creating one of these waqfs shouldn't mean that any of the legal heirs are denied their inheritance rights, and they explicitly mention that this includes women.
Okay, so making sure everyone's inheritance rights are protected.
Yeah, it seems to be about ensuring fairness and equity and how these family waqfs work.
What about the surveys of Waqf properties? Is there anything new there?
Yeah, they're changing who's responsible for those surveys. Instead of the survey commissioner, it'll now be the collector or an officer who's at least a deputy collector.
So shifting the responsibility to local revenue officials.
Right. And those surveys will now be done according to the revenue laws of each state. Any surveys that were already happening will be transferred to the collector to finish.
Okay, so more local control over identifying and surveying Waqf properties. What about the CWC and the SWBs? Any changes to those?
Yeah, they're broadening the representation on both of those bodies.
Like adding more members?
Kind of. Building on the 2013 amendment, they'll keep having representation from Muslim women, but now they're also adding 2 non-Muslim members.
2 non-Muslim members? Huh.
Yeah. And there's also provision that allows for separate boards, specifically for the Bora and Aga Khani communities, if needed.
Okay, more specific boards for certain communities. Interesting.
And the bill says the boards should also try to make sure there's representation from different Muslim denominations and communities like Shia, Sunni, Bora, Aga Khani, and other backward Muslim communities.
Wow, so really trying to make them more representative.
Right, very much so.
All right, what about registering Waqf properties? Is that process changing at all?
Definitely. They're proposing a central online portal and database for all Waqf properties across India.
A centralized system. Makes sense.
Yeah, and all existing WACs will have to submit their details to this portal within 6 months of the act coming into effect.
So everyone has to get on board with this new system.
Exactly. And going forward, no new WAF can be created without a formal written deed.
Everything has to be official and documented.
Right. And they can also deny registration if the property is disputed or if it's considered government property.
So resolving those issues first.
Right. And any WAF that isn't registered after 6 months might have problems with legal proceedings.
Oh, okay. So there are real consequences for not registering.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so big changes to the registration process. The bill also seems to be pretty clear about what happens if a property is actually government property, right?
Yeah, this is a big one. It basically says that if a property has been identified or declared as WAF property, but it turns out to be government property, it won't be considered WAF property anymore.
Even if it was declared a WAC before this new act.
That's right.
Wow, okay.
And they're giving the collector the power to investigate this and determine if a property is really government property.
So giving more power to those local officials.
Yeah. The collector submits the report to the state government, and then they can correct the land records.
So potentially a lot of properties could be reevaluated.
Yeah, possibly.
What about changes to land records themselves? Are there any specific rules about how that has to be done for WAC property?
Yeah, definitely. The revenue authorities now have to issue a public notice for 90 days before they make any changes to land records related to WAC properties.
A 90-day notice period? That's pretty long.
Yeah, it's to make sure everyone's aware. And this notice has to be published in 2 newspapers, one of which has to be in the regional language.
Okay, so reaching a wider audience.
Right. And they also have to give anyone who might be affected a chance to be heard before making any changes.
So more transparency and due process.
Exactly.
We also see some changes to the role of the CEO of the Waqf Boards, right? What's happening there?
Yeah, the CEO now has to be at least a joint secretary to the state government.
So a higher-ranking official.
Right. And they've also removed the requirement that the CEO has to be a Muslim.
Oh, okay, that's a significant change.
Yeah, definitely.
What about the Waqf tribunals? Are they being changed at all?
Yeah, they're restructuring them. They'll now have 2 members, a district judge who will be the chairman,
Right.
and a joint secretary from the state government.
So a judge and a government official.
Exactly. And one of the big changes is that you can now appeal the tribunal's decisions to the high court within 90 days.
So their decisions aren't final anymore.
Not in all cases, no. They've removed that provision that made their decisions final in many situations, so there's more room for appeals now.
I see, so more checks and balances.
Right.
Okay, now let's talk money. Is there any change to the annual contribution that WACs have to make to the board?
Yeah, they're reducing it slightly. It's currently 7% of their net annual income, but the bill wants to lower it to 5%.
Okay, so a small decrease.
Yeah.
What about auditing? Are there any changes there to make things more transparent?
Yeah, WACs with a net annual income over 1 lakh rupees have to have their accounts audited every year by an auditor appointed by the board.
So regular audits for those with higher incomes.
Right. And the central government can also order an audit of any WAC at any time.
So they can step in if they need to.
Yeah, and all those audit reports will be made public.
Okay, more accountability there. What about disqualifying Utawalis, those who manage WAF properties? Are there any new rules about that?
Yeah, there are a bunch of new grounds for disqualification.
Like what?
So, being under 21, being of unsound mind, being an undischarged insolvent, having been convicted of a crime with at least 2 years imprisonment, being found guilty of encroaching on WACA property, or having been removed from a similar position of trust before.
Okay, so trying to make sure that the people managing these properties are, up to the task and trustworthy.
Right, definitely.
Are there any changes to the penalties for those who don't follow the rules?
Yeah, they're increasing the fines for things like not keeping proper accounts, not submitting statements, not handing over property when ordered, not following directions from the board, or not uploading WAC details to the database.
Okay, so getting stricter there. Anything else?
Yeah, for some specific violations, they can also imprison someone for up to 6 months.
Wow, so the stakes are getting higher.
Definitely.
And finally, it looks like they're also getting rid of some sections from the 1995 Act. What are some of the big ones going away?
One of the big ones is Section 40. That gave the Waqf Board the power to decide if a property was really a Waqf property.
Oh, right. So now that's shifting more to the collector and ultimately to the courts.
Exactly. And they're also removing the sections about special provisions for evacuee Waqf properties.
Evacuee properties, meaning those left behind during partition.
Exactly. And another big change is that they're removing the part that said the Limitation Act doesn't apply to recovering Waqf properties.
So that means there will be time limits for lawsuits now.
Right. The Limitation Act will apply to those cases now.
Okay, that could have some significant implications.
Definitely.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, but it's important to acknowledge that, as the Indian Express article highlighted, this bill wasn't exactly passed without any pushback. There were some pretty heated debates and concerns raised by the opposition. What were some of the main points of contention?
Yeah, the article made it clear that there were protests and walkouts. Some of the things that really drew criticism were the proposals to allow non-Muslims to be CEO of Waqf boards and to have non-Muslim members on those boards.
Right, that was definitely a point of contention.
Yeah, and the opposition also really objected to giving the district collector the power to determine if a property is Waqf or government property.
So some concerns about those powers being given to local officials.
Right. They also didn't like getting rid of Waqf by user,
Yeah.
the mandatory registration within 6 months, and removing the finality of the Waqf Tribunal's decisions.
So basically, many of the key changes we just discussed were seen as problematic by the opposition.
Yeah, pretty much. And some MPs even claimed that their suggested changes were ignored and that their dissenting opinions were removed from the committee report.
Wow, so a pretty contentious process.
Definitely.
And what was the government's response to all these concerns? Why push forward with these potentially controversial provisions?
Well, according to the Indian Express, one BJP MP said the goal was to bring Muslims into the mainstream and to fix what they see as problems with Waqf management.
So they're framing it as a necessary step for modernization and improvement.
Right.
Okay, so a lot to digest here. What are the key takeaways our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, we've really gotten a good overview of how Waqf law has evolved in India leading up to this new amendment.
From the early 1900s all the way to 2025.
Exactly. And now, you know what a Waqf is, how it's administered through the CWC and the SWBs, how the tribunals work, and what the major changes this bill is bringing.
And those changes are all about modernization, transparency, and efficiency, at least according to the government.
Right.
And we also saw that there's definitely some disagreement about whether these changes are the right approach.
A lot of debate, yeah.
So a final thought for you all to consider. There are so many Waqf properties in India, something like 872,000 properties covering over 3.8 million acres.
It's huge.
Yeah. And there's this big push to digitize everything and make it all more efficient.
Right.
So how might all these legal and administrative changes affect the communities that these Waqfs are supposed to help?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it?
It's a complex issue with a long history, and it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.